Hi, this is Eric. This is episode 33 of Survival Medicine. This is a part one of a two-part series on bioterrorism. This first part will talk about why you need to care. The second part will be scenario-based examples of organisms that can be used. It's not going to be a comprehensive list, but it will be several of the more common organisms that we think will make good potential weapons and how to recognize them. So first, let's talk about an argument for relevancy. Why should you care? Well, if you're working in an emergency room, or you're a first responder, or you just happen to be somebody that may be on scene when something like this happens, this is usually going to be the first evidence of intent to use such weapons. All right, so you're going to start seeing sick people show up in emergency rooms or calling 911. And many people that study this professionally think it's more a matter of when rather than if. There are extremist groups worldwide that have capabilities in this area and are actively pursuing it. So this is not some kind of just fanciful thought, but there are people working towards this end. Now, domestically, we've had several very prominent attacks. This is the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh, so he's a local extremist. There was the Islamic extremists attacking the World Trade Center on the first time. This was a bomb placed near a support structure. They were hoping that they could make the building unstable. But interestingly enough, there was also the cyanide gas that was in there. It was supposed to be dispersed, but because of the heat of the explosion, the gas actually burned rather than vaporizing. But for those of you that work EMS or emergency rooms, you realize if a significant amount of cyanide gas had been dispersed in the air, there were probably not enough cyanide kits to deal with that in terms of a mass casualty. This gentleman, Ramzi Youssef, was instrumental in planning that attack. I think it's kind of funny because he was, I believe it was in Egypt, he was in an apartment and he was building some other bomb-type stuff and it caught fire, so he fled, but he forgot to take some important stuff like the laptop with all the incriminating evidence on it, and he was subsequently arrested. Obviously, there's the World Trade Center number 2, where they flew the planes into the building. And more recently, we've had the Boston bombing attacks, which were just conventional explosives. 2 bombs were detonated. I think there may have been a third that was not detonated. And making these bombs is becoming open source information. This is a cover off of the Inspire magazine. This is an Al-Qaeda magazine printed in English with the intent of inspiring people to take action and do very malevolent things. And the name of this extreme version of the Islam religion. There's a section called Open Source Jihad where they give you very specific instructions on how to perform these things. Interestingly enough, there's the wildfires that are burning. One of the episodes of Inspire magazine talked about lighting fires as a form of economic warfare. And I believe there's some people that feel that some of the fires, perhaps the one in El Paso County in Colorado, that may have been an exact or a direct result of this type of instruction. Here's an example of how to make a bomb in your kitchen. This basically, I think, is what some of the Boston bombing folks used. Very explicit instructions, how to use very simple things like an inflammable substance, a decorating lamp like Christmas lights, a pipe, and this is a little elbow joint. And it just walks you through of what you need to do, where you need to drill the hole, how you need to process this, pack it, wrap it, what's the electric source, here's the 9-volt battery, and the testing, using a very simple timing device that you can get from any hardware store. How to put it all together, how to create shrapnel and wrap it around things like propane tanks. And so that information is out there. And for those people that are in my mind, crazy and want to do extreme actions against unarmed civilians, then the information is definitely there. Now, this is not a domestic attack. This is a very grainy picture. This is the sarin nerve gas attack in Tokyo. This was in 1995. So some impure mixtures were placed in some plastic bags. These plastic bags were then punctured, and the sarin escaped. Since it was an impure mixture, there was a lot more liquid than kind of a vapor substance, and so it did not do anywhere near the amount of damage it could have had this been a more high-quality substance. But even still, 12 people were killed. And in my mind, that's pretty amazing. This nerve gas is exquisitely deadly and exquisitely toxic, and for only 12 people to have been killed, I think that's getting out of this pretty lucky. Now, there were 5,500 people that required evaluation. So imagine if you lived in a big city, Chicago, LA, New York, whatever, Houston. That is a lot of people to put into the healthcare system all at once, and that will definitely overwhelm things. So the motor vehicle accidents that continue to occur, the asthma attacks that continue to occur, the heart attacks. Now, these people may not be able to get in for care in a timely fashion because the EMS resources and the emergency resources are all going to be sucked up with this bolus of 5,500 patients. So I think this is a great example of why people need to learn some basic medical first aid and some initial things to do, because in a situation like this, that can make a big, big difference. Here's the gentleman in charge of the cult, Aum Shinrikyo. He looks very peaceful, but this is a very interesting organization. It's this weird combination of yoga and Christianity and Nostradamus, this kind of unholy mixture of all this weird stuff and with this bizarre thinking. But they're fairly large and fairly well funded. They've got chemical manufacturing complexes. They've recruited scientists from around the world. They have sustained research and genetic engineering and some bioagents. They've got a 48,000-acre ranch in Australia where they've actually tested their agents on livestock. Police confiscated 160 barrels of the medium that's used to grow botulinum toxin, which makes the botulism toxin. There was not the botulism growing in there, but it was the media that's used for that. It is believed that they sent a team, quote unquote, for rescue efforts to help people in Zaire during an Ebola outbreak, and it's thought that they did obtain an Ebola culture. They have been known to possess cultures with anthrax and had some documented plans to attack New York and D.C. Now here's this gentleman, Larry Harris, who's an Ohio lab tech. He was also a whack job and a member of the Aryan Nation. He ordered Yersinia pestis from a supply company. Yersinia pestis is the agent that causes the plague or the Black Death. And he faked some letterhead and sent it all off, and so the actual agency was fulfilling his order. But things like that take time. You got to go through a lot of paperwork and processing. And he was getting a little impatient, so he kept calling and badgering him about where's my sample. They became a little suspicious, contacted police. His house was raided, and it was discovered that he was not intending to use this sample for academic purposes. In 1984, in Oregon, the Rajneeshi cult was worried about how some local elections were going to turn out in terms of some zoning for some of the stuff they wanted. So they were trying to influence elections, and one way they chose to do it is to spread salmonella all over 10 salad bars and some different restaurants. 750 people became ill, and there were no deaths. This did not significantly affect voter turnout, and they still lost the elections. In 1979, in Russia, there was a plant that was producing weapons-grade anthrax. There was an air filter that had failed. It was noticed on the night shift. A note was left for the oncoming day shift to replace the air filter. That note was not seen. It was missed. The plant was started up. It ran for just a very few seconds. The alarm went off, and everything was shut down. But a small amount of weapons-grade anthrax was released into the air. Now, the Russians state that only 64 people died because of this incident, but U.S. intelligence satellites show 3,000 coffins in the area, so I think the Russians may be slightly underreporting the amount of dead. In the 14th century, the Tatars were laying siege to the city of Kaffa. It wasn't going as well as they had planned, so they decided to take plague-infested bodies and put them in catapults and launch them over the walls. This worked. They were able to capture the city. I'm not sure what good that did them, because now they had a plague-infested city. The French and Indian War in the mid-1700s. This was another example of some biological warfare where Sir Jeffrey Amherst gave blankets to the Native Americans infected with smallpox, and had a very significant and devastating effect. The Native Americans did not have any immunity to smallpox at that time. They had not been exposed to this illness, and it was devastating to them. In World War I, Germany sent people over to the United States to kind of try and sabotage our efforts to wage war, and that was specifically targeted at livestock, the mules and the horses. Very limited effect, but they were attempting to do it. Unit 731 in World War II was a branch from Japan's military arm. They used multiple biological attacks on mainland China. This was a very significant effort. 150 buildings, 5 camps, staff of 3,000. Now, this did not always go as planned, however, and some of this backfired, and some of the Japanese became ill because of shifting winds or other things that were hard to predict. In World War II, during the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland, the Nazis seemed to be particularly afraid of typhus, and people realized that you can use this Proteus organism as a vaccine to induce a false positive test. And so people in the Warsaw Ghetto would show that they were positive for typhus, and the Nazis seemed to leave them alone because they didn't want to get infected. Here's Saddam Hussein from Iraq. During the first Gulf War, there was evidence that he was interested in pursuing biological weapons. These were vats used to grow botulinum. Just recently, this is within the last few months, I don't believe there's a date on this slide, but Homeland Security had sent some stuff on a web alert thing, and they were giving for guidance for how to respond to a wide area aerosol anthrax attack. Now, I got this from 2 or 3 different sources within a very short period of time, which did raise a little bit of concern. This, normally you don't get 3 of these from 3 different sources all clustered together, so it made me wonder if there are some people that knew things that I did not know. This is Ken Abeloff. His name's been changed because he is a little bit more Americanized, and he was picking a name that we could pronounce easier. But he was the gentleman in charge of the Russian Biopreparat. This was the Russian arm to create chemical and biological weapons. Now, there was a treaty that we weren't supposed to be doing that, and it was only for defensive purposes. But he was told by the Russians, or the Soviets, that the United States was planning on wiping Russia off the face of the earth, and it could be through a biological attack. And so he did a lot of work on biological weapons. He did some very advanced science and had some amazing results on what he could do in terms of lethality and administration. Now, at one point, we had some exchanges where the Russians came over to visit our sites, and we went over to visit their sites to make sure that everybody was abiding by the treaty. After this gentleman came over to the United States, he realized we were abiding by the treaty, and we did not have a sustained offensive bioweapons program. He became somewhat despondent, even suicidal, and then he decided to defect and sort of counter some of his life's work on killing people and try and help prevent and work on the defensive standpoint. So if you read his book, it's very interesting, very sobering. But in that, he talks about there's a very large amount of smallpox that exists. Now, smallpox has been eradicated from the face of the planet from a natural standpoint. The only smallpox that exists are in these weapons caches. They had developed this multi-drug resistant plague, Marburg, which is similar to Ebola, not quite as lethal, but they were working on one guy accidentally pricked himself and infected himself and died. It seemed to be very virulent. His last name started with U, so they have variant U for Marburg virus. They've combined different viruses together, the Venezuelan equine encephalitis combined with smallpox to make things even more contagious. And Ken claimed that even smallpox and Ebola had been married together, although U.S. intelligence questioned that was done successfully. So why in the world would you use a bioweapon? Well, in my mind, this is a poor man's nuclear bomb, right? This can be done without significant science. To build a nuclear weapon, you really have to have advanced science and advanced machinery in place to do a significant nuclear weapon. Now, this any grad student could do. Well, any undergrad student could do, really. Well, I take that back. Anybody that decides to read and study and try can probably do this. It doesn't take as much money. In fact, it takes just a fraction of this. A fraction of the money. It can be tasteless, odorless, invisible. It can get through any type of metal detector screening. You don't have to have highly advanced equipment, and small amounts that you could carry on your person have the capability of killing thousands of people. Now, the U.S. is aware of the threat, and they have some very advanced sniffer systems in ports and airports and things like that will detect traces of this floating through the air and can alert people if somebody's trying to do something really bad, nasty. But I don't think these systems are foolproof, and there are always avenues to get around the security. Let me give you an example of lethality. Let's take anthrax. Now, this is assuming perfect conditions. This was from the Office of Technology Assessment in 1993, so this is a while back, but this assumes perfect weather conditions, perfect winds, perfect humidity, which is unlikely to actually occur. And they said if we take a small single-engine airplane, a Cessna with the ability to spray like a crop duster and delivering 100 kilograms of anthrax. So 100 kilograms, you have to imagine that's about the weight of an adult male, maybe a little bit more. Well, Americans seem to be a little heavier than some. So perhaps a standard American adult. So 100 kilograms sprayed over DC could cause between 1 and 3 million fatalities. Again, this is assuming perfect conditions, which I think is unlikely to occur. And you have to have the properly weaponized anthrax. But even if this was off by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100, that's still a lot of people that would die. And then there would be the extreme panic from everybody else that would overwhelm the healthcare system. Botulism is another example. 1 gram, one tiny little gram of aerosolized botulism could kill 1.5 million people. Again, this is assuming worst case scenario, perfect conditions. But you should see very small, minute amounts have a ability to have a huge impact. Now, there's a lot of challenges to providers. So those of us that work in the emergency sector, number one, it can be hard to pick this up. It can be hard to diagnose. A lot of this initially looks like the common cold or the flu. So symptoms can easily overlap common illnesses. The diseases typically have an incubation period, so the onset of illness can be delayed from when they were initially exposed, and that can make it hard to track back and figure out when this occurred and where it occurred. And if it happened in a large city, all these people could be going to different doctors. One person might go to the regular doctors, one person could go to one emergency room, another person could go to an emergency room across town, and so it'll be hard to see the pattern initially. Now, with more and more victims, the pattern will start to emerge, but in those very first stages, it can be very tricky to pick up. Now, in terms of managing patients, if you've got a large number, that in itself could overwhelm resources. And then you've got the panic side, where people show up. When I was working in the ER many years ago, when they had the anthrax letter bombs after 9/11, I had people that would show up in the ER and were worried that they were exposed to anthrax, and I asked them why, and they said, well, they saw a white substance in their refrigerator, and I asked them, did you know what it was? And they said, yeah, it was cottage cheese. So I'm like, well, if you knew that it was cottage cheese, it's probably not anthrax. But nonetheless, we had many people show up in the emergency room concerned about exposure when there was, no need for it, but that took time and effort to deal with them and process them. Now, some of these agents can be very contagious, and then you have infection control, so the healthcare providers don't get infected themselves. And then there's some treatments that are limited, right? I mentioned the cyanide kits earlier. If you had a large cyanide attack, the hospitals typically don't have enough cyanide antidote to deal with more than just a handful of people. In the news currently, Syria was mobilizing their chemical weapons, and now there's questions about have they actually been used. I don't think that's been confirmed in a public or public arena, but I think some people are very suspicious that that has been used by the Syrian government. So hopefully that gives you some reasons to pay attention and actually care about this. I believe the threat is real, and I think being educated on what to do on the initial phases and what to watch for is important. So part 2 will deal with specific agents. And again, thanks for all the views and all the comments.